All right, Marisa Waxman, Philadelphia City Budget Director. Thank you so much for joining us as always.
Oh, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
So before we get into questions about the upcoming budget process, could you tell us a little bit about your role and how that works in city government?
Sure. So I'm the city's budget director, and the city actually has a collection of different budgets, but the biggies are our general fund, which is operating all of our day-to-day services, trash pickup, police, things like that. And then our capital fund, which is where we invest in infrastructure. And together, that's about $8 billion a year for those two funds. The role that I play in my office and team is that we facilitate the process of developing a budget proposal each year, turning the mayor and council and community member input of priorities, turning that into nuts and bolts numbers and a piece of legislation. And then over the course of the year, we monitor to see how things are going, see if anything's out of alignment in terms of how much money is coming in or how we're spending it, and try and make sure that we monitor and sort of flag any problems, get us back on track whenever there's an issue.
Okay, now I imagine there are a lot of different ways to look at the budget. Can you tell us a little bit about your department's philosophy and how you look at it and how you put it together?
Certainly. So one of the things that Philadelphia cares a lot about is making sure we understand what bang are we getting for our buck? What do these dollars turn into in terms of programs or initiatives? So in our operating budget, the budget is broken down a couple different ways. First, by department. So we've got, a police department, a fire department, a finance department. And then within the department, there's two other ways we look at it with more fine details. One is looking at what we call programs. So like say within our streets department, we break it down into there's a sort of a sanitation or a trash pickup program that's separate than the program for recycling. There's a program for street lights. There's a program for engineering. There's a program for the different types of work so that, we understand that we are spending this much to pick up trash and this much to repave roads. And then also the other way we look at it is what type of spending is it? And so we have one category that looks at our salaries and all of our personnel costs, our salaries, our benefits, things like that. For the city, that's about 2/3 of what we spend is on the salaries of city employees who are doing the work. The, healthcare workers in a health center, the procurement specialists, making sure the contracts go through. We also then, other categories we look at are how much we spend on goods, supplies, just paper and, anything we need to get the job done. There's big capital investments. That's when we need to buy a trash truck or build a building or repair a building. And we also look at how much we spend on things like debt service. That's another category. When we've borrowed money in the past, like a mortgage, we have to repay it. So we also break things out in the type of spending it is and cross-reference that with the program altogether. How much are we spending on salaries, on equipment for a discrete bundle of things like EMS service.
So what it sounds like, and from previous discussions, we've had, the budget process is a year-long kind of thing. It doesn't, even though it's kind of ramping up right now in preparation for the mayor's budget address, you're doing this all year. Where are you right now in that process?
So we're doing two things. We're actually always thinking about 3 budget years at the same time. So we're looking back to the fiscal year that most recently ended and making sure we really understand what happened. Sometimes payments come in late, sometimes payments go out late. And so we're just making sure that is all locked down and now is in the process of being audited, that we know exactly what happened in what we call fiscal year 22. Right now we're in fiscal year 23, and now we're doing that monitoring that I talked about, that, the budget was voted on last spring. Our fiscal year started July of this year. So we just released our quarterly city managers report last week, and that reported on the first half of fiscal year 23. And it tracks how are the revenues coming in compared to what we expected? How's the spending going compared to what we expected? And how are our departments performing? We keep in there performance measures. We track overtime, we track leave usage, and keep an eye on just the overall operations and fiscal condition of the city. So we just reported on the first half of FY23. And then the third budget year we're looking at is the future. And so, as you mentioned, next week is the mayor's budget address, and he'll be proposing his FY24 budget. And that'll be Mayor Kenny's 8th and final budget of his mayoral administration. And so that's where we're looking ahead. We've gathered information from community members, from departments, from community leaders, used all of that to develop a proposal for next year that the mayor will announce.
So it's probably still a little early and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but very generally speaking, can you tell us a little bit about how remaining surplus money and American Recovery Plan funds could possibly be utilized in the upcoming budget?
Sure. So the American Rescue Plan gave Philadelphia $1.4 billion, which is a huge, wild amount of money. The challenge for us was, though, that because of the shutdowns and because of the economic impacts of the coronavirus, we lost more than $1.4 billion in expected revenues over time, not all in 1 year, but we do a 5-year plan. And when we were projecting, we're like, it's actually going to be a more than $1.5 billion budget gap. So to even just keep doing what we normally did, we were sort of faced, if that money hadn't come in, massive layoffs or giant tax increases. And so what the American Rescue Plans do is let us avoid all of that bad stuff by filling the gap but we don't fill it all in 1 year. The American Rescue Plan dollars were designed that we had a couple years to use them. They all have to be used by December 2024. And so what we're doing is we're still waiting for our revenues to catch up with where they would have been pre-pandemic. So we've been able to sustain our service delivery and even make some new investments, even though our collections, our revenues haven't recovered yet. And it's those American Rescue Plans, plan dollars that fill the gap. We call it revenue replacement. And so we can't isolate, I could tell you, and we're spending it all on just this one thing or just the other. But really, it's coming in as revenue. So everything that we've been able to sustain, every bad thing we've been able to avoid is because it came in and filled that gap. And so each year we're drawing down some of that money. So last year we used the first 250 million. This year we're using 335 million. Next year, 391 million. And then the last year, a bit over 400 million. So over 4 years, we're going to be using it. If we didn't string it out that way, if we had, just used it the first 1 year or 2 year, we'd hit a cliff. And then we'd be back in the same position of having to make really hard decisions. But by spreading it out over 4 years, our revenues from our taxes and other sources are recovering. They're growing back. And so hopefully by the time we get to that period in December 2024, we'll then be generating enough of our own revenue to sustain our services and not fall off that fiscal cliff.
Okay, I'd like to bring Denise Clay Murray here on Philadelphia Home.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Waxman. You say that hopefully by December 2024, we'll have revenue collections that equal the money that we've gotten from the American Rescue Plan. But you have a lot of folks who are saying, this money, over $1 billion has come in, and was it really supposed to be used for, to fill in gaps, or was it supposed to be used to do things like, particularly in the city of Philadelphia, work on our poverty plan, work on our poverty issue? Can you speak a little bit to that, and for why we're using it to fill in gaps rather than deal with the poverty issue?
So I would say, and I really appreciate that question, because I know that a lot of people have questions about how this has worked. And I think that, if we didn't have this money, and it was 100% intended to be used for filling this when the legislation came out, it clearly has the provision to use it as revenue replacement. So we have no concerns about whether or not we're using it in accordance with how the federal government intended it to be used. So I think you're speaking more, though, to the choices we made, though, because it was pretty flexible. And for us, addressing poverty in Philadelphia really does require us to be able to sustain a lot of the services we have. We've been able to make investments to move us to get stable 5-day library service, and then move to starting to now get to 6-day service in some areas. We wouldn't have been able to do that. We probably would have been having those conversations we had during the 2008 recession about, do we need to close our libraries? We've also been able to continue to attack a lot of the underlying issues that drive poverty. For example, we've been able to dramatically increase our investments in education. Since the beginning of the Kenney administration, the city's annual commitment to the school district has grown by 171%. It's, over $250 million each year. Ensuring that we have education really does speak to poverty. And similarly, the investments we've made in community college, both by our basic contribution to them, but also introducing the Octavius Cato Scholarship Program, which is intended to really reduce racial disparities in graduation rates and time to graduation by providing not only tuition assistance, but all of the other supports that folks need: money for books, childcare, transportation. And so being able to sustain our, what folks think of as standard services that really do support Philadelphians, as well as increase and deepen some of our investments in foundational programs, not even, that isn't even getting to the pre-K, is trying to attack poverty in certain ways. And without these dollars, we really would be in a dramatically worse position than we are.
Now, the question I asked is based on conversations I've had with people in the community who see this pot of money and they're like, okay, well, why can't we do this with it? Or why can't we do that with it? Do you think that the reason why these questions are being asked is because folks don't quite understand what this was all about? And could the city have done a better job of explaining this to people?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that we have struggled, and we do have some materials out there that I'd be happy to share about like what this meant. Because one of the analogies we use is wit and wit out, like a cheesesteak. Like, with this money, here's all the things we've been able to do. Without it, we luckily didn't get to the point of having those conversations about large tax hikes and library closures and things like that. But you're absolutely right. We can do more. That's why I love opportunities like this to come out and talk to folks. We also have been trying to do more community engagement around the budget. So leading up to next week's mayoral budget proposal, we held numerous community engagement sessions with over 400 folks, community members, community organizations, business leaders, folks from nonprofits, cultural organizations, city frontline employees, to try, and we do two things. One is a bit of, pulling back the curtain on the whole budget process. And that includes conversations like, hey, what is the deal with that American Rescue Plan money? But also it creates an opportunity to hear from community members before the mayor's budget proposal gets put together, to understand what community members are asking for. And so, a lot of what we heard is that folks are really concerned about violence, that's something that we really need to address. We need to continue to address homelessness and housing security, as well as education. And so, those are the things that, as we're developing the budget going ahead and figuring out, with the American Rescue Plan dollars combined with every other dollar we have, how do we attach those to the things that community members are prioritizing?
Now, last year, you when you came and talked to us about the budget, you said that there was going to be an amount of the budget that the community was going to decide what it was going to be used for through a series of community budget hearings that you all were having. Are you going to do that this year? And is the money that the community is going to have a say on going to remain the same? Is it going to increase? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And unfortunately, that's one where we wound up hitting the pause button. What we learned as we worked with community members was that doing this on a full-scale citywide basis didn't really make sense. That if we were getting votes and we put a playground in Juniata, what does that do for a family in Eastwick? And so we've taken a step back and really looked at how has this worked in other places. And usually it happens for smaller geographies. And so we've started to engage in conversations with some council members to see if we can retool this, because we didn't see it working as we worked with community members on the citywide scale. So unfortunately, there isn't a lot of progress for me to report there. I think it's something that we're not at a place where we know if or how that's going to proceed, because in talking to community folks, we realized we didn't want to move faster than the speed of trust, and we didn't want to put out anything that wasn't going to be successful, and doing it, you know, in that way and pitting, you know, swaths of the city against each other, we realized in talking to the community members was not going to be satisfying. And so we think it's important to really revisit that and not move ahead with it as initially envisioned.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, and you're still listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
Okay, thank you, Denise. Marisa Waxman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I love coming here. Thanks so much for chatting with me about the budget.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care. Be well.